Hey, Gabe.
Hey, what's up, Tim?
So, in Star Trek First Contact, the Enterprise crew travels back in time so it can help to build Earth's first warp drive prototype using, I don't know, like an ICBM in an old missile silo. What happened? They couldn't find an old DeLorean and a box of plutonium lying around?
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. As always, you can listen to the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, YouTube, wherever else you may listen to podcasts. And we're also on the internets at supercriticalpodcast.com. Check out that website for a full list of episodes, some resources on the show, and the occasional bonus feature or two. My name is Tim Westmeyer. I am someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear security for a living. And I'm joined by my co-host, Gabe. Gabe, how you doing?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me, Tim. And yeah, I'm no nuclear expert, but I'm just here to listen to Tim's crazy ramblings and try to make sense of it. And unfortunately, Joel, the normal co-host, he couldn't be here today. He's on a 5-year mission to Vulcan, and I hear the Wi-Fi is a little bit spotty there, so he couldn't join us.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunate for Joel not being here, but we are happy to have on the podcast today over Skype Manu Saadia, who is the author of the book Trekonomics, The Economics of Star Trek. Manu, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
We're happy to have you here because we need some real subject matter experts for Star Trek, because we've covered nuke plots of Star Trek episodes before, as well as one of the latest Star Trek movies, the Star Trek Beyond reboot movie. But we want to get deep into the Star Trek canon here. So we're talking about a movie where it's a much simpler time. It's a time where Earth didn't have to worry about warp drives, matter materializers, Vulcans, Romulans. It was a simple time when humans could just sit back, have a drink, crank up the volume on the jukebox, and build a spaceship out of an old ICBM they have in their backyard. We're here to talk about the 1996 movie Star Trek First Contact.
All right.
Yeah. Well, as the poster tells us, resistance is futile, so we couldn't put this movie off for much longer. Let's get into it. This is a film directed by the bearded wonder himself, Jonathan Frakes, who played number 2, William Riker, on the show. He also directed, I didn't realize...
He's number 1, sorry.
Oh, he's number 1?
Yeah, he's number 1.
Oh,
yeah.
I took him down a peg. I'm sorry, guy.
He is the first officer.
He earned that because he's directed a number of Star Trek movies like Star Trek Insurrection, a bunch of the Next Generation.
He's also number 1 with the ladies.
Yes. Well, I've seen the way he sits in a chair. It's very impressive how he puts his foot over the back of the chair every single time. Yeah, but it was written by Brannen, who started as an intern on the Next Generation before he brought up to an executive producer. So he's worked his way up the ranks as well as Ronald D. Moore, who show ran the reimagined Battlestar Galactica, which I'm a big fan of. Ronald Moore is not necessarily everyone's favorite person in the Star Trek fandom. Is that true?
Really?
I've heard people badmouth him and Brannen Braga as kind of hijacking. I don't know, Manu, what you've heard about it, but I've heard they kind of hijacked the show and took it.
Really?
Yeah, like they were kind of the brains behind Enterprise and all that mess. And
they're amazing writers. I mean, they also wrote Mission Impossible. Like these are really top-notch writers. I like their stuff. Ron Moore, he's known for being the Klingon expert. Like every big Klingon episode, like Ron Moore was there. I mean, and Brannen Braga, I have so much respect for all he's done. He's a wonderful person.
If you go on the internet and read through forums, you can find something bad written about anybody.
I know that my opinion is not widely shared.
Well,
but that is okay.
Well, I think a lot of people liked First Contact. It got 93% positive rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Anything over 70 is pretty good. So, in the 90s. That's not bad.
Yeah.
Roger Ebert thought it was his favorite Star Trek movie, and he gave it 3.5 stars. Was pretty good with the critics of the Academy. It got nominated for an Academy Award for Best Makeup, and then won not 1, not 2, but 3 Saturn Awards.
Yeah, I mean it's a solid movie. I could preface by saying that I'm not so fond of like big action Star Trek. I'm more of a, but that's going to be obvious as we talk. I'm more of a, the mind game or puzzle Star Trek than action Star Trek. But as far as entertainment, this is fantastic.
You're more of a fan of the episodes that focus on economics,
or weird stuff where nothing. I like episodes where nothing happens, because like it gets your brain going.
Yeah.
But it's a movie is very different from TV show. Like you have to grab people by the proverbial, I guess. And, it's like you have an hour and a half, so you have to do something.
Well, we have an hour and a half here to do the podcast. So let's get started with the plot discussion here. So as usual, spoiler warning, if you haven't seen this movie from 1996, you should probably find it somewhere online, or probably it's in your local Blockbuster Hollywood video collection somewhere. You can get it.
It's currently for Prime subscribers on Amazon. You can watch it for free right now.
That's true.
That's what I did
last
last
how we
night.
watched it, yeah. Perfect. That's great.
That is a compelling reason to sign up for Amazon Prime right there.
Which is one of our sponsors for now. 2 of our previous 3 episodes that we've done on Star Trek, we've covered on the podcast. They had elements of time travel and nuclear weapons. I think this is an interesting well that the Star Trek universe keeps going back to: time travel and nukes. So we covered Star Trek episodes City on the Edge of Forever and Assignment Earth, which both dealt with these topics. I guess the message here is you have to watch out for those temporal vortexes. They just keep falling into them and then mixing themselves with the nuke world.
It's interesting that there are a lot more time travel episodes than you'd think throughout all the series. It seems to be a crush almost.
Yeah.
It's when they want to say something about the present that's very serious and important. That's what they do. So.
This movie seems like a weird funhouse mirror version of City on the Edge of Forever. That one had Spock and Kirk sent back in time because I guess McCoy got sent back in time earlier and saved someone who ended up leading this peace movement that prevented the United States from entering World War II, which allowed the Nazis to build an atomic bomb, which allowed Nazis to take over, which led to no federation.
And Kirk falls in love with her.
Surprise.
But this time around in this movie, it's similar in the idea that they're trying to go back in time to stop the Borgs from altering history, the Nazis' equivalent of this. But this is more of an active stopping someone from altering the past as opposed to setting time back to the way it was through neglect. This is more of an active response.
It's a Terminator type of story in a way.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's 6 years after Terminator 2. Save the future. Save the future.
I never thought about it that way. That's interesting, yeah.
So in Terminator, there's the robots being sent back in time to prevent Earth from being able to fight against them.
Yeah.
In this one, we got our own robot combination, a human with robot parts, the Borg. Why don't you guys, as the Star Trek experts here, I'll stop talking, lead us through the plot here, because we have the big villain here is the Borg. And that comes from the television show, right?
Yeah, so the Borg are, for those who, you've probably heard the term, even if you're not familiar with Star Trek lore, they're kind of like the arch nemesis. So after the Klingons stopped being the arch nemesis in Star Trek, they needed kind of a new arch villain, and the Borg took that on, starting at Star Trek Next Generation, and again, through Voyager, really. But Manu, you saw the movie actually last night, right? So
yes.
So you might be able to walk through kind of the basic plot, and I'll chime in.
So we start with the Borg attacking Earth and the Federation. The Enterprise comes in, swoops in, destroys the Borg cube attacking Earth. But then there's a little piece of the Borg cube that escapes. It's a sphere, and it creates a temporal vortex, and it goes back in time, and the Enterprise follows it into the temporal vortex all the way to 3 days before first contact.
According to our astrometric readings, we are in the mid-21st century. From the radioactive isotopes in the atmosphere, I would estimate we have arrived approximately 10 years after the Third World War.
Makes sense. Most of the major cities have been destroyed, very few governments left. 600 million dead. No resistance.
Captain.
There you go.
Ah.
April 4th, 2063.
So what's First Contact? This sounds important because it's in the title of the movie.
Because at 11 o'clock, an alien ship will begin passing through this solar system.
Alien, you mean extraterrestrials? More bad guys?
Good guys. They're on a survey mission. They have no interest in Earth. Too primitive.
Oh.
Tomorrow morning, when they detect the warp signature from your ship and realize that humans have discovered how to travel faster than light, they decide to alter their course. And they make first contact with Earth, right here. It is one of the pivotal moments in human history, Doctor. You get to make first contact with an alien race. And after you do, everything begins to change.
It's the day when Earth first launched a spaceship, warp-capable spaceship, and there were Vulcans passing by on a survey mission of gaseous anomalies or something like that. And they detect the warp signature and they come back to Earth and they say, hello, live long and prosper. And this is the defining event in the Star Trek future history where the first contact with the Vulcans will lead to utopia on Earth.
And this is kind of at an interesting time, right? Because Earth is in the midst of this post-nuclear nightmare type scenario, right?
Yeah, they didn't catch us on our best day.
No, I mean, it's somehow Dr. Zefram Cochrane, who's one of the main protagonists, scrapped together enough material and titanium and stuff to retrofit a Titan II missile and build a warp spaceship. And this is all out of a small community around silos in Montana in the mountains. Like they're rugged mountaineers, almost like Ayn Rand figures, like self-sufficient mountaineers who are building spaceships. It's a little strange, but it works great in the movie. I don't want to nitpick. And so the Borg is there to actually, prevent first contact and take over Earth. And they are slowly taking over the Enterprise while the Enterprise people are down on the planet, or some of the crew is down on the planet trying to help Zefram Cochrane build his ship, because the Borg, the first thing they did was to fire photon torpedoes at the silos. So suddenly first contact is in big jeopardy.
The idea is that the Borg, by preventing this first contact, they can alter the human race will not progress on this path to becoming a spacefaring species. They will stay kind of saddled here on Earth with all their problems, and they will be an easy.
No, I mean, like the Borg will take over Earth and assimilate everybody and make it a Borg utopia. The Borg is interesting because it's really the exact opposite or mirror image of the Federation in the whole universe. Like they're the only other society in the galaxy that are kind of a post-scarcity society where the question of supply and demand is no longer a problem. They don't use money or anything. Like everybody's sort of work in unison. So they're very much analogous to the Federation. But so it's the battle for Earth once again. And of course, the good guys win at the end.
Of course. As you said, Manu, there's like this battle going on the ship while there's this battle on the Earth. So on the ship, I think one of the people from Earth ends up getting sent to the ship, Lily Sloane. I forget exactly how she gets there. I think there's some emergency.
And so she's hurt, and they sort of take the injured onto the Enterprise based on the notion that, they'll keep them sedated and they won't see anything. But then the Borg is taking over the ship slowly, and so the doctor has to wake up all the patients and go into the Jeffries tube and disappear and escape.
So Lily, she's with Captain Picard through a lot of the movie, and Picard is... So I think the important detail here is that Picard, he was actually assimilated at some point. He became a Borg and was...
In the TV show.
In one of the episodes of Next Generation. So he has this very special relationship with... knowledge, relation, and I think feels very personally affected by the Borg taking over his ship, trying to, impact humanity. And I think the big metaphor here, or the callback is to Moby Dick, where he's like this Captain Ahab who's obsessed with destroying the Borg at all costs, and Lily, through their conversations...
breaks his bubble.
Exactly, yeah. Absolutely.
And Lily is an interesting figure because she's also it is intimated in the movie that she's in fact the person who built the ship. she's like, oh, I was scrounging for titanium everywhere, and and she seems to be at least as important as Zefram Cochrane in terms of who built the ship and who's got the brains behind it.
Yeah. Well, she doesn't get a statue. So some of my favorite parts of this movie are the interactions between Zefram Cochrane, who, again, he's in 2063, and a lot of our characters in the show are from somewhere in the 22nd century? 24th century. So to them, this is something that they learn in elementary school and in their history books, and they, centuries later have this image of Cochrane as a pure figure, someone who is almost saintly, like how we would look at the founding fathers of the United States. Or
and they're like, I went to Zefram Cochrane's high school. And he's like, oh my God. And I mean, there are these very funny things where he's like, well, I did it for the naked woman and the whiskey.
Yeah. Well, he's a drunk. In the movie, he's portrayed as this very flawed hero. It's like going back in time to meet George Washington, and the night before they're going to cross the Delaware River, he's wasted with with women around him.
I find it interesting that Lily, in fact, it's really, at least to me in the movie, it's very clear that she's the brains behind it. So there's a not so subtle, actually very direct nod to, there's always a woman behind it, and it's somehow the guys they hog the credit. But I like that. I thought it was very well done. They could have turned Zefram Cochrane into a woman. Yeah. But they couldn't because canon.
He makes an appearance in one of the early original series episodes. Yeah, they pull him out of there. So also on the ship, the other kind of storyline is Data, the android who's on the crew, is one of the most beloved characters on Next Generation. He's actually captured by the Borg, and even though he's a machine, they're trying to basically convert him or exploit his humanity, the humanity at least in his programming, in order to try to extract some codes for the being able to fire the weapons. So
Data locked all the computers on the Enterprise.
That's right.
At the beginning, once it becomes obvious that the Borg is taking over, and so they need to get him to release the encryption of the computer so that the Borg can actually target the ship and destroy it. Have full use of the offensive capabilities of the Enterprise. And so there's this whole game between the Borg Queen, who's really the bad guy there.
Yeah, and she's a great character.
She's an amazing character, but it's a little forced, I think. Just introduces a new level of complexity in the Borg that I think, they needed it's a movie. It's an action movie. They couldn't do all the explaining that the Borg doesn't need a queen to function.
Yeah, it is odd to figure out what rules they're playing with this collective. They don't attack you unless they're told to, or if you pose a threat. So you can walk up to one of them, but as long as you don't, smack them in the face, they're not going to attack you. But they all seem like they operate together. Do they all know each other's thoughts? If one of them sees that, so okay.
It's the general will. It's Russo's general will put into a sort of a cyborg organism. It's very strange. It's very interesting. But then, it sort of clashes with the notion that there would be a queen.
It reminds me of Animal Farm. All Borgs are created equal, just some are more equal than others.
Yeah, right.
They seem like they have some control. So you talk a lot about in your book, Trekonomics, about these ideas of scarcity and the abundance of resources and what that would do for a civilization. And there's a lot of that in the conversations between Picard and Lily, where they start to talk about what money doesn't have a role in the 24th century. And
yeah, because Lily is visiting the ship. She's walking besides Picard, and he has a gun, and they're trying to figure out where the Borg is, and she's like, "Oh my God, this ship! It must have cost so much to build." And Picard's like, "Well, the economics of the 24th century, the economics of the future are quite different." I do an awful Picard.
That's a pretty good, the cool, rational, exactly, diplomat.
It's almost like the best distillation of the economics of Star Trek you could ever get. And of course it's Braga and Ron Moore. Basically in three phrases, say, well, we're no longer interested in money. We do things to improve ourselves in the 24th century. century. She seemed a little dumbfounded. Like it doesn't make sense to her. And there's a lot of that clash between her, Zefram Cochrane, the people down on Earth, and these sort of almost Buddha-like figures, explorers who are altruistic and do things only not out of economic incentives, but I'd say passion or sense of righteousness, justice. That's why I love those time travel episodes, because this is where you get like a much more clear understanding of what's the normative ideals of Star Trek are about. You see that in the whales movie. So the movie where Kirk and crew go back to Earth to save the whales, and they're like, "Oh, they're using money here. What is this?" Yeah. And it's like they try to go on the bus and they don't have change. It's very funny. But this is where a lot of these episodes allow us to explore what it would mean to live in a society that functions on very different basis than ours. I think the First Contact for that is wonderful because also, there's a lot of action and it's very entertaining. And at the same time, it carries a deeper message in the best way Star Trek can do.
So while they're doing all this on the Enterprise on Earth, part of the Enterprise crew is helping Zefram Cochrane rebuild his ship. And they are able to launch in time.
Let's rock and roll!
6.
And they have a dramatic scene where the rocket takes off with the Phoenix on board and goes into space, and they get ready to do the first warp flight. At the very last minute, the Borg fire some weapons at the ship, but Data, at the very last minute, Data, who's been kind of almost assimilated by the Borg Queen, she thinks she has him to release the codes. He thwarts the attack at the last minute, and Picard and Data fight and defeat the Borg Queen on the ship, and the warp flight takes place, and the movie ends essentially on this great note where the Vulcans come and do first contact, thus restoring the timeline and allowing humanity to engage on the course toward the Federation. So it's a good ending.
The Vulcans tell us about the amazing features of space travel, and they help us recover from the post-atomic horror, and we get to introduce them to homemade liquor and rock and roll, which I think that's something that's highly missing in the Vulcan homeworld.
I read your book, Manu, and I must say I loved it. It was awesome. One of the things I like the most about it is that you kind of interpret that just because humanity gives up money, it doesn't give up its drive and ambition, right? It's just channeled through this different means of improving yourself, exploring the galaxy, art, culture, things like that. And
I mean, a hierarchy still exists.
Right, exactly.
And, competition still exists. It's just different objects.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's how Star Trek does it. The problem, I think, in Star Trek in general, and that's where talking about nuclear weapons is very important, is that there's no clear explanation on how you get there. And there's no how-to on how you get to that different type of social relations. And there's a nuclear war, tabula rasa. It's really how you get there. That's all you get as a sort of explanation on how to change society, which is extremely grim. Is nuclear war, as explained in First Contact, is nuclear war the only way to change society?
That leads us perfectly into our next phase of this discussion. Phaser of this discussion. It's the nuclear discussion. So let's get super critical. I see two major areas of conversation that we can follow. If you see more, we can change and adapt as we're going through here. But the first one is that it's the role of nuclear war in Star Trek lore. Like, does this have to have had taken place? This gigantic nuclear conflict that took place over 30 years. We'll get into the details of it in a second. Is that necessary for us to reach that Star Trek utopia that we see in the 24th century? And the second thing, we'll talk a little bit about the cool appropriation of nuclear tech in the movie, the Phoenix warp drive that was used and built on top of a Titan II ICBM body. So let's talk about this first section. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just going to read from research that we've diligently put together. In the Star Trek mythos, Earth was engaged in a global nuclear war from 2026 to 2053 that resulted in 600 million dead, most major cities destroyed, governments collapsed, and humanity was left in a pretty bad spot So over those 3 decades, conflict is apparently seemed to continue to happen. The Vulcans, our friends in the Federation, saw that this war was happening, but they considered it a local jurisdiction matter. And because of Prime Directive, I don't know if that term was used by them, but the concept they wouldn't interfere with a civilization, a planet, until it had created a warp drive technology. It seems to be the thing here.
Seems to be the norm, yes. I looked back, and there are mentions of nuclear war in the original series in several episodes. It's never fully explained at length, but there is a long nuclear war according to the original series, so in the 60s, at the end of the 21st century. Which is also strange and interesting because the original series, it's like the UN in space and peace through space exploration and all that stuff. And yet there's still a nuclear war to get there. It's not this thing where we're going to pull ourselves out of it through diplomacy. Which, by the way, is interesting. I was recently trying to read this big book about inequality and the history of redistribution, and it's by a Stanford professor. But the gist of it is that throughout history, major moments of wealth redistribution have happened in conjunction with major catastrophes. So the plague, World War II. At least if we look back, as a way to sort of think of the future, looking back can be useful. The sort of very stable polities that we have in Western Europe today are the results of World War II. And the kind of, when you think about it, we have achieved Star Trek, at least in Western Europe, in terms of quality of healthcare. Everybody can eat, except like small marginal portions, and for which policy could actually make a big difference. Poverty is no longer endemic. Standards of living that we enjoy today, in the West, are very close to post-scarcity. We still use money, of course, but we have achieved that. And we have achieved that in large part because World War II, and there was this sort of great moment of reorganization, forcible reorganization of the world. And, I'm thinking, my background being in economic history, I think of Bretton Woods and the post-war organization of the monetary system and the economy. We have achieved that. It's not completely crazy to think that the kind of social transformation and global social transformation that you see in Star Trek would happen after a major war. Because this is what has happened in the past. It's extremely grim. I don't want nuclear war to get to Star Trek. I
wish it was a different way.
Hopefully we'll do better.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly serves as a plot device. The details are kind of sketchy depending on where you look, but this is super critical, so we kind of have to look at the details here. So in the movie, they say that there are 600 million casualties because of this war, and one thing that struck me when watching the movie is I kind of ran the numbers, and that's actually really low. So if you extrapolate the current world population to 2026, assuming like a growth rate of around 1.1%, you have about 8.3 billion people. That's only about 7%. That 600 million is only about 7%, which is a really low number for an all-out nuclear conflict.
And the other thing is, most of that population will be mostly in Asia and Africa. Already is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and by 2060, I think Africa will be, sort of half of the world's population, something like that. I don't have the numbers in my head right now. So it's sort of a little Eurocentric or Western-centric. And maybe those 600 million, they're in Northern America and Europe. And that's what happens. They never quite say, right? There's the Eastern Coalition.
Exactly.
And,
yeah, there's some vague, clearly some different like sovereignties and alignment relative to what we see now in the world, but it's never clearly discussed, right? Is
the Eastern Coalition China? I don't know. I mean, they don't really think through all the politics of launching nukes against each other.
Exactly.
Well, that's why they needed us on the payroll to get into it.
If only Brannen Braga had the three of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my problem with this stuff is I'll get too focused on that and then not the broader messages and themes that they're trying to get to. You said you didn't want to nitpick, but that's kind of my job. So I think that the movie overall, the plot, uses the idea of a nuclear conflict, but really picks and chooses the consequences of those things. So we already talked about the idea that 600 million people died, but they said most major cities were destroyed. So maybe they were evacuated. There's maybe we don't know the type of warfare that took place. Was this just all out nuclear conflict against all cities and all military targets? Was it using relatively large bombs or these small tactical bombs that were used on the battlefield? We really don't know. There's no description of all of those things except the fact that cities were destroyed, which makes you think that they were some kind of larger weapon. But as you were mentioning, Gabe, the idea that 7% of the population seems pretty low. During World War II, approximately 3% of the world's population was killed in a conflict that only lasted 7 years.
Yeah.
Let alone 30 years and basically a global conflict. But I also don't understand why there isn't any sort of residual effects of nuclear fallout, because they describe in the Star Trek lore there were nuclear winters during that time period. Not one, but multiple. So you can get into the science of whether or not you think nuclear winter is possible.
They solved global warming, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, the emissions are way down.
Yes.
Thank you, Manu, for the cheerful note.
Yeah. But unfortunately, theta radiation is way up.
Yes, that's a problem. The other thing about the cities being destroyed, so you would think, all the communities of engineering excellence that are around cities are probably gone. Where do you get an education to actually figure out how to build a warp-capable vessel? It takes literally thousands of engineers to put a tiny probe into space, and supply chains and programming and all these extremely complicated things. And we're not even talking, a spacefaring mission. We're just talking. I was thinking of the James Webb Telescope. Mm-hmm. It seems that you need networks of engineers and centers of knowledge working in concert together to do that kind of thing. A project like the Phoenix, so that warp-capable ship with, life support for 3 people on board. That's
yeah.
I don't see those mountaineers doing that on their own. I mean,
no, that's a great point.
You need a government or a government agency or a very rich person. But
because Einstein says you shouldn't be able to travel faster than light, to be able to have that kind of project, that's like the Manhattan Project, several orders of magnitude. And Manhattan Project had the full commitment of the U.S. government and leading scientists and research institutions. Well,
so in the movie, they say Cochrane says that he wanted to sell this technology to who? Who's, for what purpose? To who? I mean, what's the idea? What this world looks like? Let's help to try to explain this a little bit. It sounds like there was a very uneven distribution of the nuclear conflict as well as the recovery effort. So I rewatched the first episode of The Next Generation. I think it's
Encounter at Farpoint,
and there's a big scene in there where this mysterious figure Q sends the Enterprise crew back in time to, I don't know what they say exactly at the time, maybe around 2040, 2050, when there was this nuclear conflict, to see this condition in place called post-atomic horror, where there were mock courtrooms set up to have trials, judge, jury, and execution. The whole thing's over in a few minutes because all the lawyers have been killed. And you see this is taking place somewhere. So there was this nuclear war, and some parts of the world apparently have not recovered from this. There's people with radiation sicknesses and mutations, and there's even a guy in the 2050s, Colonel Philip Green, who tried to euthanize hundreds of thousands of people that were suffering radiation sicknesses to essentially clean out the blood supply so that in the future that we could have mutation-free populations. Clearly it's happening somewhere, just not in Montana.
But in a way that's kind of realistic. I would say, at least. The dirty secret of it all, right? I mean, either nuclear war or global warming is that the effects are going to be the effects are going to be distributed wildly differently across the globe. Some people are going to do okay, and they'll be there at the end game. So right, I mean that's it's unfortunate, but that's the truth, right? Maybe all those who go into the bunker will survive. You know, mine for. That was the joke behind that in Kubrick's movie is in fact very meaningful. I think that the effects are going to be unequally distributed. So that's what you see there. It's like maybe all these guys you see like with the jukebox and drinking and all that stuff, like they're all super duper Harvard engineers and JPL people, retired to the provisional JPL in the Montana Highlands or something.
and maybe they're drinking so much because that's their response to the horror. I mean, there's a lot you could extrapolate from it. I mean, in the movie, the whole colony they have, it doesn't look so bad. From like a physical, it looks fairly nice. I mean,
except for their fashion taste,
right.
I love the hats, the backward hats with the belt buckles on them. It's like like pilgrimage.
But then you see like Zefram Cochrane, he really drinks a lot of tequila, right? Where does the tequila come from? I mean, how do they procure that? That means there is resupplying. There are supply chains. There are trucks going in and out. Like they're not growing their stuff under the pine trees. Like it's not survivalist. So I'm like, the world has done badly, but not so badly that you cannot have engineers hanging out and building a spaceship.
I mean, there's some reference in the movie about like the ceasefire, that there's some ceasefire. I think Lily talks about it in the ship. So yeah, clearly, I mean, this kind of gets into something I was thinking about the movie. I mean, I think about Prisoner's Dilemma when I see this in Nuclear War, and that there's a ceasefire that they've been able to cobble together to allow themselves to kind of have tequila still being shipped, but it seems very tenuous because it seems like there's a definite incentive for any side to then just launch another weapon, because if you don't launch a weapon, somebody else could do it and kill you. And it seems like this Vulcan landing seems to break the prisoner's dilemma in some way. That it's not really explained exactly how, but contact with another species causes Earth to just, everyone puts down the weapons and everyone says,
cooperate.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one of my favorite theories is an idea called the overview effect. Have you guys heard about this? I know I talked to Gabe a little bit when we watched the movie. The overview effect is the idea, it's astronauts, when they return home from a mission, when they're in space, the idea of looking at Earth in its totality, you look at Earth and you start to think, wow, so we're really just this small planet in this larger universe where I don't see the borders. The borders aren't drawn anywhere. And you start to have this feeling of oneness with humanity. And people, they'll come back and they're interviewed, and across all these different countries that are spacefaring, all kind of have similar feelings. And it's this idea that, we're together now that we should have a common mission. And
it's the pale blue dot, right? It's the
exactly,
pale blue dot
yes.
speech. It's all that has ever lived, and all that you've ever known, and yeah.
Well, it's weird. I mean, It's weird because I think about this, like the people that I know that, and not to pick on anybody who have kind of the most closed mindset are people who have like never left their hometown, right? And then you know about people who travel the world, right? And who have been to different countries, and they tend to have a broader mindset. And then you can extrapolate this to people who have left Earth and seen Earth. They probably have an even broader mindset. I mean, take that to the next level of meeting an alien. Like, what would that do to you?
We're in fact trying to figure out what is cosmopolitanism today in the era of atomic bombs and space travel or space exploration. And I'm very pessimistic about this personally, because if atomic bombs have not forced us to become cosmopolitans, and you remember, and you're specialists, right after Hiroshima, a lot of the scientists involved in that and some politicians were like, one of the reasons we need to give the bomb to the Russians is so that everybody will be able to have bombs, and therefore we're all in this together and we'll neutralize each other, and something bigger and better will come out of that. 50 years of Cold War and mutually assured destruction and, game theory doesn't seem to have brought about this sort of practical cosmopolitanism that a lot of people were hoping for. It's a negative cosmopolitanism. Like the effect of the bomb, like nuclear tests for 20 years in the atmosphere impacted everybody, not just the people who were studying nuclear bombs. So that's my lesson for the past 50 years, and you see that playing out in the sort of global prisoner dilemma game that is global warming. I bet you if aliens were to come in today, like we would be fighting each other to be like the first guy who can sell them some.
Right.
I mean, the technology is mine.
This was something I wondered. Like when the Vulcans land and make contact, like why wouldn't you say, okay, teach me how to make great weapons and I can destroy the other side?
Maybe the Vulcans will be like, no, because they're Vulcans. But
exactly.
They happen to be Vulcans. Imagine if they were not as advanced and cosmopolitan.
Imagine if the Klingons led.
Or Ferengi.
Yeah, exactly.
Ferengi, not Ferengi.
Sorry. This is why I'm here doing the nuke stuff. This is why I got you guys here for the Star Trek.
No, but I really, there is this sort of idealistic notion in Trek that somehow the Vulcans will unite us. In the real world, maybe even, and I'm not a conspiracy guy, but maybe we have had some contacts with aliens, and we were like, yeah, that, I'm keeping that for me. I mean, that would be the logical thing to do.
Well, Manu, I mean, I'm curious because, you write a lot about this, in your book about getting to post-scarcity and how that changes things. I mean, from your vantage point, how does the meeting with the Vulcans tie into all of that portion of Star Trek lore? Because it clearly is important in some way. How does it get us over the hump to this post-scarcity environment?
And I'll add something here real quick. Similarly, the fact that there have been other spacefaring nations that have come in contact with the Vulcans, but you have people like the Romulans, the Klingons, the Kardashians, and others that
growing
are
up with the Kardashians.
Yes,
isn't it Kardashians?
Kardashians.
Kardashians.
But the Kardashians.
I like the Kardashians.
And also, but all of these other civilizations that have gone through this first contact exchange, but they're still very warlike, and I don't think they consider themselves to be a part of this utopia. As much at all. Not. So why was their experience different than Earth?
I think it's the Vulcans. The Vulcans are these idealized stoic humans. This is the Vulcans. You have to assume they're us in the sense like what is the best we could hope for as humans once we get over our more base instincts or behaviors. You serve others and you grow and become better yourself. That's the meaning of live long and prosper. The greeting, like live long and prosper. It's not like live long and get rich. It's like cultivate yourself. It's an injunction to cultivate yourself and to become a better person and to serve others. So this is really something that has more to do with the kind of normative ideals that the creators of Star Trek wanted to convey, like we can be better, we can, and it comes from the 60s. It's we can be better through space exploration. There's this optimistic thing that peace through space or peace through nukes. I mean, it's the same. Comes from the same place. Peace through technology. It comes from the same place.
And if you think about where Star Trek came from, it was born out of this time of Cold War, of uncertainty, it's maybe only appropriate that the birth of Star Trek, the Federation and Star Trek canon comes out of a similar place.
So let's get kind of meta here. Star Trek, the original series, and then Enterprise later on, all come from that same Cold War anxiety. Next Generation was a little bit after the end of the Soviet Union, which is a different philosophy here as well, but probably still some residual effects of the Cold War.
But in Next Generation, man, there's a Klingon on the bridge.
Working together. Yeah. Do you think maybe, not to be mean to the current reboot, or maybe, I don't know what Discovery is going to end up being like, but do you think maybe that idea that, nuclear war led to Earth being a better form of itself and space travel as the thing that brings us together. Is that a message that's kind of lost these days because we don't have as much anxiety? Sure, we're worried about North Korea, but most people don't go day to day worrying about whether or not a bomb's going to drop on their family. Because that's gone, do we then just resort back to, all right, well, this is now an action movie because we don't have to worry about those philosophical ideas anymore? I wonder about that because I still enjoy the new Star Trek movies, but there is something lost in that type of storytelling.
I think Star Trek has sort of dropped the ball on dealing with the real problems of today, which are, which is global warming. And I don't see much of that in any science fiction.
Oh, what about Dune?
Yeah, but I mean, Dune is super old, man, and Dune is more, isn't it like a sort of a fantasy about colonialism?
Yeah, kind of.
With the spice, gotta get that spice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you gotta get the spice flowing.
Well, there's that one episode of Next Generation where they figure out that warp travel actually destroys. Yeah, has environmental effects. That seems like the closest that Star Trek's ever gotten.
Yes.
Yeah, and in that episode, they refer as well to nuclear winter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these. I mean, it's a faulty episode in the sense of it's hard to address such an issue and to make it personal. It's easier to do the day after as a movie than to do flooding and things drying up everywhere.
Right.
That's I think the complication with global warming is that it's not as cinematic as nuclear war.
I'll make my case that Game of Thrones, at least thematically, touches on some of those things. So I'm the person who wrote the article that dragons are nuclear weapons. Did you read the Vox explainer on this, where they say Game of Thrones is all about game theory and cooperation? There's the article of Game of Thrones is all about ... Yeah. Anything has been done, which is cool. That's why I enjoy the stories very much. The idea of climate change is a real thing, and it's not just funny that the ice zombies represent climate change, but it's this idea that you're speaking to, that climate change is an issue. It's hard to grasp in your head the global consequence of this, and if humanity doesn't like to think about those things. There's a quote in the show about how human brains aren't meant to deal with problems that large. So we we fall back on things that we normally would understand, which is fighting over who gets to control things, or fighting the Soviets or the Russians or terrorists, whoever we happen to be fighting these days, or amongst ourselves. That's an easier problem to deal with, and it's hard to come together, which I think Star Trek tries to do. Show a world where we have come together. But they need the crutch of massive global destruction to sort of make that more meaningful. If, Star Trek was just, and then, the economy grew at 2% every year for 200 years, and then we sort of did it. It's not that exciting. So do you think if the Vulcans landed in... All right, so 2023 is the war, right? 2026. So let's say the Vulcans landed in 2000 and before World War III. I forget the dates here, but before World War III, if the Vulcans were to land here, would we have a similar?
Or what about if they land tomorrow? They land here tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay. What if they land tomorrow? What do we do?
Yeah.
There's Donald Trump.
They wouldn't clear immigration, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Build the dome.
Yeah. Maybe they'd land in China. I mean, but then the Chinese, they would be like, they contacted us. We are the natural leader of the human race.
Yeah.
Well, that's why one of my favorite Superman stories is the Red Sun story, which is a kind of counter alternate history where instead of him landing in Kansas, he lands on a collective farm in I think it's Ukraine or part of the Soviet Union.
Wow.
And it's a different, it's a cool
That's
story.
awesome.
I enjoy that one.
You mean, and he becomes like a hero of the Soviet Union for exceeding his quota? Is that...
Yeah. He's productivity is
he
up.
got so much wheat.
Yes.
He made so much wheat.
Yeah.
And he mined so much coal, much more than Stakhanov.
Yeah.
Sorry. The nuclear war thing bugs me. That's the thing. It bugs me in Star Trek because it comes from a certain place in the history of the show, but it's not necessary. That's the thing. Like these mountaineer dudes, who build the You don't need a nuclear war. Actually, it's kind of a problem if you have a nuclear war to build like a spaceship. Building such a spaceship needs cooperation. It needs government. It needs, research centers. It needs crazy people like Elon Musk. It needs visionary government. It should be a much more collective affair. Instead of Vulcans coming in tomorrow, imagine a dude comes in with plans tomorrow and say, okay, I solved it. Here's a way to actually, go to Alpha Centauri in a year. It would break physics, but imagine this would happen. What would we do? Would we all marshal all these resources to do it, or would it be sitting in the pile at DOD because we have other to deal with?
Yeah, no, and I mean that's kind of like the plot of that movie. Well, the Carl Sagan book Contact, right, where they get the plans to do that, and humanity rises to the challenge, so to speak. And I think thinking back to your book, Manu, I mean, we are living in this age of abundance, and we have the ability to do these things. It's just that we have these other, when you think about global warming, I mean, this is a problem that I think humanity is able to solve. What seems to be limiting us right now are the institutional frameworks, the kind of political economy, the things like that.
If Star Trek were to happen, I believe the cooperation in the institutions will already have been there. I think in all logic, there should not ever be another nuclear war.
You had mentioned the frustration you had about the role nuclear war plays in the Star Trek canon, and I think that was felt by a lot of other fans. There's this, the Trekker Choice Awards. It was in September 1996. Paramount Pictures, as well as Microsoft, did this online vote where 250,000 people on the 30th anniversary of Star Trek, they all voted on like their favorite scenes or characters or catchphrases, and there was an award called the Oft-Heard But Never Seen Award for the favorite historical moment only alluded to in Star Trek. And what won was the World War III nuclear war. There's clearly a frustration there amongst fans,
It's the obsession about how do we get there? Yep. It's the obsession about how do we get to Star Trek society.
So I'm willing to be a little lenient on this because I see Star Trek as a story that's not like a single movie, obviously. It's not even a single show. It's told over decades now.
Right.
Different writers, different showrunners, telling different stories, reflecting on contemporary themes. We talked about like the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, post 9/11, whatever Discovery may end up focusing on, which seems to be maybe some identity politics.
For those who are not initiated, Discovery is going to be a new TV show coming out in September 2017. It's the latest Star Trek TV show after they've had about more than 10-year hiatus on TV.
So I think because of all of that, even though I like to nitpick, it's at least reasonable why the nuclear plot is confusing and maybe sporadic. Maybe the original, maybe Roddenberry didn't want to talk about this as in much detail, but the people at the end of the Cold War that wrote The Next Generation, this was right on their minds, and they thought this would be great levels of conversation. They even invented things like their own spin-on stuff. Matter materializers are always the thing that interests me the most about that particular show, because there wasn't matter materializers in the original series, right?
You mean the replicators?
The replicators, yeah, the matter replicators. Because I always thought it's fun because can you make another replicator with the replicator? How do you?
Oh yeah.
You can set things that you say you won't be able to build a weapon, but I think about this stuff because what happens if a replicator is used to make plutonium or uranium or any other sort of weapon grade material? Because that's one of the biggest checks we have on preventing any person from building a bomb is being able to get their access to this material, or just 3D printing a actual bomb itself. I don't understand why that isn't talked about in the Star Trek universe. Maybe there is some episodes about it, but you introduce an idea like that, you better have an episode on it.
I just read an interview with Ron Moore about that, where he said that they were staying away from replicators as much as possible because it was the end and the death of all stories. Yeah. Because, I mean, replicators are the foundation for the economics of Star Trek. Like, suddenly nothing has value. But if you want to tell dramatic stories on TV, then it becomes complicated because, what do you live for? If I wrote 70,000 words on this, but
I got you. It's one of my favorite chapters in your book. I triggered you to talk about it.
Yeah, but it's kind of a weird thing, right? You're right. I don't see any reason why a replicator would not be able to make plutonium. Um, Also, here's another thing: plutonium-based weapons are fantastic. Like, why don't they use them more? I mean, they seem better than photon torpedoes, honestly, like at close range.
We got in that pretty deep in our Star Trek episodes that we did last year.
Right. I mean, it's sort of that little one of these little, plutonium-based thermonuclear thing like that probably is better in Babylon 5. So that's for the super nerdy.
Yeah,
that's
Babylon 5 is even nerdier than Trek.
That's our listeners.
They use there's a moment when they use a nuclear bomb in space against an adversary much more powerful. So that's one thing about Trek that I find strange. And yes, the replicators were always very problematic for storytelling, or not. I mean, look at in First Contact, so. You don't see them using the replicators that much, and yet the replicators are there, but it's still a great story.
First Contact seems a lot more about hardware of the time, and I mean, one of the things is this Phoenix, the actual missile, which is it's pretty cool that they didn't just replicate a new one; they actually went on Earth and helped Zefram Cochrane and his people build it. So
cool. Let's get into that part of it. That's our second item of
discussion. Oh yeah, why didn't they use replicators to actually replicate the missing parts in the Phoenix?
Maybe they were because they were fighting on the ship. Okay. But that's a good question. On the ship, when they're fighting the Borg, apparently Tommy guns are highly effective against the Borg because the Borg can't adapt to it. They are able to adapt to the frequencies of the phasers, the alternating pulses and all that. Why don't they just replicate some handguns or some...
I believe that you get into trouble on a pressurized spaceship if you start using bullets.
But phasers are okay. You can shoot a wall with the phaser. Okay,
it's a special setting. Resonance.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Hey, that techno babble works for me. All right, this is good. So let's get into the Phoenix talk. Yes. So the Phoenix is the ship. It's probably the most famous ship in the Star Trek.
Other than Enterprise,
right? I guess what I mean is like inside the world.
Right.
People don't. Maybe the kids when they're learning and growing up, maybe they don't know about the Enterprise, but they've heard of the Phoenix.
Right.
Yes.
And there's this great scene in the movie where Picard and Data. So Picard's the captain, Data's the android. But what is his role on the ship?
Lieutenant Commander.
Lieutenant Commander. So they're together in their garb of the time, their contemporary garb, which is mostly vests with or without sleeves, but a lot of vests. And Picard, and I'll let you, Gabe, be Picard here, and I'll be Data.
Isn't it amazing? This ship used to be a nuclear missile.
It is a historical irony that Dr. Cochrane would use an instrument of mass destruction to inaugurate an era of peace. I like that idea a lot. It's a fun.
Nice.
Thank you. I've been told by many friends that I'm robotic, so it works out well. My emotions chip is usually damaged, mostly in 2017. So this idea of using former weapons of mass destruction, or just weapons in general, and transforming them into something different, is this concept, this swords into plowshares idea, that you turn weapons of war into weapons of peace. And there's big examples of that, like the Phoenix in literature, and there's also tiny little examples. Like my latest toy that I'm enjoying is a bottle opener that's made from the copper that was stripped out of decommissioned nuclear launch facilities. When they got shut down, someone bought all the copper and turned them into bottle openers in the shapes of atomic bombs. And it's called Beers Not Bombs. You can buy them on Amazon or from their website.
I mean, it's make love, not war, right? I mean, it's very right. I mean,
exactly, yeah. So I enjoyed the plot of this movie quite a lot. The themes are great, all of that, but I really geeked out on the idea that they used a Titan II missile in order to build the Phoenix.
So I have a big question. Can a Titan II, without modification, not only go into orbit, but beyond orbit? Because they're on a trajectory that's beyond, they achieve liberation, right? So they didn't do that with Gemini. That was not the point, right?
Right. So now you're jumping ahead, but I think this is a great question to think about, because it is a cool theme to use the weapons and turn them into space launch vehicles, and we did versions of that in reality. So I think that's a good thing to worry about and keep in the back of your mind here. So I'll just say that the Phoenix was built in the movie on the nose cone of a Titan II ICBM. These are the big missiles that will travel all the way across the Earth and hit their targets while they enter space before they land back on their targets. So this is a Titan II is a large 2-stage liquid-fueled rocket. It was the largest that the United States ever developed and deployed in terms of its ICBMs. It was built by Glenn L. Martin Company, who now we know them as a company called Lockheed Martin, after they formed together.
Martin Marietta, and then,
Exactly. Okay. This is a really big missile. It has the throw weight of about 8,000 pounds or 3,600 kilograms. And throw weight is the different definitions of it, but the idea is the payload. So it's not just the weight of the missile. It's on top of the weight of the missile. It can carry this amount of material, which is usually a warhead and the delivery package and the reentry vehicle. It can send that on a particular path. The more you can carry means you can have multiple warheads on them. The bombs can be bigger. The guidance packages can all be a little bit better. You don't have to be as efficient. So those are the big thought process behind why we decided to build and deploy such a large missile itself.
And 8,000 pounds, that's what, like about two or three cars, basically?
Yeah. That's pretty good for the weight that you would need to build a warhead and multiple warheads.
So how do they fit like something like the Phoenix on it that has 2 nacelles and then 3 people and the life support system? And I mean,
it seems a little bit. Maybe you have to say it's an advanced version of the Titan II that was developed.
We don't know.
Or they found some new fuel source that increases the capability.
So the missile itself is about 103 feet long and 10-foot diameter. The Phoenix, according to things like Memory Alpha in the show and movies canon, is about 90 feet long by itself.
Oh, okay.
So they had to do some modifications to it. So they used a real life Titan II missile that you can visit yourself. It's at a museum in Tucson, Arizona. They filmed this over about 4 days while they were there. I think they had an idea that they were going to do a missile, and then the executive producer or maybe an intern found, hey, there's this missile that we can go check out. So then they went and filmed there. So they had to make some modifications to it so that it would actually fit together. I think what they did was they took the missile body and then put a fiberglass capsule on the top of it. And that was supposed to be the Phoenix system itself.
And in the cut, like you see, like there are very few seconds where you see the full assembly because it's all like in the silo anyways.
Yep.
But 90 feet on top of 100 feet in the real world, complicated.
Well, they use camera tricks and certain types of lighting to make the missile look larger than it actually is. I think they recognize that as a problem. But it's a cool idea to use this real life missile system as well. So the one thing that they probably got wrong, and that's, again, we don't know what life was like.
Montana?
Yeah, so they say it's in Montana. At some sort of missile silo in Montana. In the real world, in our world here, the U.S. Air Force planned for about 120 of these missile systems to be in place, but only 54 were ever deployed. And they were deployed with 18 at a site in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Oh, so they're the same as the one in Command and Control? Like
yes.
They're the same?
Yep.
Oh my God, okay.
Absolutely. So these are the same weapons.
These are not good systems.
They're very precarious. But
not something you want to be launching on the first warp flight.
No, I wouldn't want to. But they were deployed basically in Arizona, Arkansas, and Kansas, but never in Montana itself. Where we have today in Montana at Malmstrom Air Force Base, it's a home of the 341st Missile Wing, the Air Force Global Strike Command, and that's where today we have a lot of our Minuteman III missiles. This is the current model. They're just announced last week. The Pentagon has a contract out with a new firm to build the next generation of missiles.
We're geeks on the web and we know where the missiles are. Okay, so in case of nuclear conflict, global nuclear conflict, chances are the Chinese or whatever, the Eastern Alliance or something, they would know and they would have bombed the hell out of this.
I'm surprised.
Already.
I'm surprised it's not a crater, and I'm surprised it still has an unused ICBM. Why wasn't it used during the conflict?
And they still have jukeboxes there, so yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, we know where silos are, we tell them where our silos are. It's part of transparency.
Well, Manu, I was at Tim's apartment when we were watching the movie. I asked him this question, and Tim's like, "Oh, I have a book on this," and he goes to his shelf that has like full of nuclear books, and he's like, "Here's a map of all the different silos, and you can tour them, and they're here." And I'm like, I'm just in awe.
Okay.
Yeah. So clearly in China, they probably have a copy of this book.
Yeah, I would think so. So it's interesting why they decided in Montana. Probably because of the rugged scenery. It's a lot, maybe a little bit better than having it in Kansas or Arizona or Arkansas. Maybe not as interesting of a landscape. But there is this fun little story that I came across here. We actually talked about this on our Independence Day episode. We did one on the Independence Day movies. In 1967, there was a mysterious event that took place at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. This was there was one of these missile silos that just went offline, and they couldn't figure out what happened. The systems weren't working. They weren't able to communicate, and it was a very precarious time. The guys who were in the silo were freaking out why their systems went offline. At the same time, people above the silo command center saw some mysterious lights in the air, and and according to UFO watchers, this is an example of aliens visiting Earth, telling us, one, we can shut down your ICBMs and your missiles, so don't use them against us. Or two, trying to tell us, hey, you should stop these things, and then maybe we'll let you join the Federation. If you get rid of all of your nuclear weapons, we'll invite you.
Yeah. It's a little overdrawn, right? I mean, maybe it was just like, they never figured out this one.
No,
like,
I mean,
what happened?
No, it was clearly the Vulcans, right? That's
yeah. Well, there's or Q or somebody doing something.
Simple.
I mean, I think the official explanation was that the systems failed because they fail all the time. It's not the first time that something like this has gone offline, and there was something in the air. Who knows what it was. But it's an interesting idea that Montana was chosen after this particular story took place. Where
interesting.
I thought that was kind of neat.
Although the Montana they show in the movie is like clearly mountainous. Like, do you have any silos in mountains? Like, doesn't make it even any sense to build a silo? Because you could imagine, in the next 30 or 40 years, they're gonna build a big base with big silos somewhere in the mountains.
Right.
That's not easy to build a silo in the mountains for missiles. Like it's
I remember from the map, most of them are in the plains, right?
Well, right now they're in the plains,
Okay.
But it depends on the kind of system you wanted to create. I mean, if you wanted to do what China does and what North Korea is trying to accomplish is a lot of their missiles are on trucks. They're mobile missiles. So they'll be on a truck. They'll go into a location. The missile will raise up. It might be fueled at that point, or maybe it's already has solid fuel, and then it gets launched. Now, you want these things to be moving all the time. The Russians would put them on trains. If you have these mobile missiles, hide them in a mountain. So China has hundreds and hundreds of miles of mountains, tunnels that they've dug out just for this purpose, so that we don't know where all of the cave entrances are, which ones they're going to use.
I again, being French, I say submarines.
Yeah.
Why bother? Just put them in submarines.
Yeah. Well, that's the North Koreans are taking that advice, and they're also trying to build submarine-launched missiles as well. So, as you alluded to earlier, the Titan II missile system has a very interesting history when it comes to accidents. This is not totally the reason why they got replaced, because they actually were in service 8 years longer than what they were expected to be, because of the fact that they were a very handy tool for the military because of how big they were and how much they could carry. But they were eventually replaced by the Minuteman missiles in 1987. The last Titan II was deactivated in 1987, and the missiles were broken down and sold for scrap in 2006. So according to our world, these things don't exist anymore. When first contact was made in 1996, there were some deactivated missiles in storage in California and Arizona, but it would take a lot of work for them to be reassembled. And and all of that.
See, in 1995, when they were building the movie, the production, they didn't have such a powerful internet. Google did not exist. I mean, that's what happens. Google did not exist at the time.
But so the Titan II has, as we mentioned, it's a big weapon. It's two-stage, and it's a liquid-fueled rocket. The rockets that we have these days are solid fuel in the United States, and it's good because it means that it's fairly stable. It can be launched within 4 minutes, essentially, once the order is given. They're pretty quick. You don't have to fuel them, because if you have to fuel a missile, it takes a long time because these are big tanks, and you can't fuel them ahead of time because after a certain amount of time, the fuel's corrosive and it will eat away at the components. So the Titan II was an interesting innovation because it had essentially two types of fuel mix. It's hypergolic, meaning if you put these two mixes together of liquid, they'll go off. That's great. It means that within 60 seconds they could be launched, but it's also incredibly dangerous. These things can spontaneously erupt, and they did on a number of occasions. In 1965, 53 workers died in a flash fire that got started in Arkansas because of a fuel leak. And the instance that you were referring to later on that's in the book and now a documentary movie, Command and Control, in 1980 in Damascus, Arkansas, which I always think is funny that there's a place in Arkansas named Damascus, but in Damascus, Arkansas, a socket wrench fell 80 feet off of a maintenance platform, punctured the missile's fuel tank, caused a leak, and a couple hours later, a gigantic explosion took place in the silo and destroyed the entire silo and killed one of the airmen that was trying to put everything out. The explosion blew off the silo door. It launched up the second stage and the warhead out of the silo. The second stage exploded and propelled the warhead 100 feet from the launch facility's gate door.
That's terrifying. Yeah. So a nuclear weapon was just hurled out of this thing.
Hurled out. They found the warhead. There was no radiation leak. The bomb didn't go off, but it's certainly, you can foresee a world where it could.
It's a testament to the quality of the design, right? That the actual head did not go off or anything. Like, it's amazing.
Yeah. Although this missile was one of the ones that had a flash fire, a similar incident a couple years before. So yeah, it's designed great, and it's why you have these safety mechanisms, but hard to envision that never happening in the future. And it's also great that Cochrane never dropped a wrench during one of his rock and roll benders when he was building them.
Well, that's why I think it's Lily who built it.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, she's a little more stable. She has more stable hands.
Yes, and diligent and serious.
I mean, it's just also shocking to me, too, that given that it's so dangerous, that this actually did fly astronauts. And I think, Manu, you mentioned during the Gemini program, they actually used this rocket to fly astronauts into space. So there's some precedent for the Phoenix.
I mean, let's all admit, like actually launching people into space is super dangerous.
Yeah.
It's like it's not something that's regular or normal or anything else. It's crazy. It's strapping yourself to a bomb.
And it's expensive. So you want to reuse the parts that you might have left over from somewhere else. So 12 of these Titan II missiles were used in the Gemini manned space missions. And some of the big names in the astronaut world, people like Buzz Aldrin, James Lovell, Mike Collins, Neil Armstrong, all took a ride on the Titan II. The Mercury missions before used Atlas ICBM. So again, they used...
And Redstone.
And Redstone.
Yeah.
So that's...
Well, I mean, it's the path dependency, right?
Yeah.
We had those missiles, so we put people on top of them. I love the fact, like, what I really like in the movie is the moment they launch with the music and the rock and roll and all that, and it's sort of it's shaking, and apparently, I mean, it gives a good sense of what it would be like to go on a rocket ride like this.
Yeah.
I think it's an homage in the sense to that.
The Titan II was famous for having this weird vibration.
Really?
That it was fine for missiles. It was within the margin of error, so they were okay using them. But when they got turned into basically people movers instead of warhead movers, they had to do some things to change that modification here. I'll list off a few of the things that NASA did to transform this into a human space flight machine instead of a rocket one. I don't know much about what this means, but I'll list off some of the cool ones. A malfunction detection system was installed.
Okay.
Yep.
That's good. Malfunctions are bad.
Yeah, lets them know if things are working. And Gabe's a pilot, so he knows maybe some of these systems here. A lot of redundancy was added.
Redundancy is good, yeah.
The inertial guidance system was switched out with one that used radio ground systems, which allowed communications and adjustments to be made in a missile that's for weapons that gets launched up. That's it. There's no communication with the missile. You can track it, but you can't like send a signal to say disarm the rocket or something you would see in a Mission Impossible movie. They don't actually exist. There's no communication with the missile. It's all one way. It's not two way. But you want to do that for Space One. The first stage of the rocket was loaded with 13,000 pounds more of the propellant than an ICBM, so it could travel farther, as well as put more fuel so that it would burn longer. So you asked earlier about whether or not you could break orbit with this. Well, Gemini didn't break orbit. The whole thing was putting a human in orbit. But I could see some modifications being made to the rocket. I'm not a rocket scientist. I just pretend to be one on a podcast. But I could see some modifications being used with technology because there's no discussion if they fueled the rockets. They talk about theta radiation in the movie that seems to be using, I guess, in the Star Trek lore, like anti-gravity?
Antimatter
stuff. So maybe they use that tech instead of liquid fuel. I don't know.
When the footage, or at least in the movie, you see clearly like the second stage and, like the fairings, like the little explosions and all that stuff. So, or the explosive fairing release system, something like that. So it's not antimatter in there. In the Phoenix, what the hell do they use? Like, they don't have dilithium crystals.
Yeah.
Or how do you generate a warp field?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, so Ron Moore said that in the early stages of the script, they were thinking about something other than dilithium to power the warp drive. He said that actually we had talked about it being from something modified from the thermonuclear warhead, that somehow setting off the fission reaction is what kicked it off.
Seemed like they didn't go with that, but that would have been
very
quite
fitting.
a thing. Now, so we talk about this in one of our episode on The Martian, the Ridley Scott movie, where there was this project called Project Orion.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
I know that.
Yeah, so it used like 200 small nuclear bombs to take something, using the force from that, there'll be like a deflector plate on the bottom of the missile, and how it would get out of the orbit and break away from Earth's orbit, and then also travel within space. You drop a little nuclear bomb in a capsule, it explodes, and it's like pushing someone away.
Do you think that one would vibrate a little bit?
A bit. There better be some shock absorbing systems there. Like, that's when I see Ron Moore talking about that, I was like, maybe you did your research on that, or
the weight that you would have to carry, the kind of payload you would have to carry out of orbit, to actually break the warp barrier. That sounds to me a little. It's a dramatic feature presentation. It's for fun and entertainment. There are some shortcuts, but that one's a big one. First of all, it's as you said, it's a Titan II missile. Like, your chances of actually putting this thing into orbit are like 1 in 3 or something like that. I mean, would you bet all your antimatter, that you scrounged or something on such an unreliable system? They probably modified it and all that, but even then, I think that the weight of it sounds a little fishy. But we're nitpicking.
Well, I also never knew how it landed back on Earth.
Oh, there's that.
Yeah, because it didn't look like it, or how it made course correction adjustments. But there is this really cool discussion. I think it's in one of some behind the scenes, maybe in like a Star Trek magazine, where the production designer, the artist who came up with the design for the Phoenix, said he wanted to combine things that seemed contemporary for 2063 with what we see in the future for Star Trek. And he had to modify things, and that's why he has the warp drive engines on the side that come out from the rocket when they separate. And it was a challenge for him to combine all of those things together.
Yeah, it's art. You have to there's narrative license and artistic license. I mean, but when we look at it afterwards, like 20 years later, we're like, okay, guys, come on. That's the other thing. You probably would want to assemble that stuff in space, like in orbit. But that means you need state actors, universities, training programs, blah, 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 blah.
Probably not a global thermonuclear war 10 years before.
Yeah. Why? I mean, that's the other thing. Like, really? There's been a thermonuclear war? Like, don't we have, like, other problems?
Yeah. So we're already starting to get into what I call the parking lot movie discussion. So let's take our own time machine we slipped into Skype has a feature for temporal vortexes. So we're 1996. We just saw the movie in the theater. Where before we go our separate ways, we're having a conversation about what we thought about the film.
Yeah.
So one of the things I like about Star Trek and this stuff is the time travel. Why do they seem to go to it so much, especially when they deal with nukes? You already mentioned how it's a great contrast between the problems that we have today versus the solutions that they've come up with in the future. Are there time travel plots that don't involve nukes in Star Trek?
Oh yeah, quite a lot.
Yeah. The whale.
Oh yeah. Well, no, but
that's
when they go looking for the nuclear whistles.
Please, we're looking for the naval base in Alameda. Could you tell me where the nuclear vessels are?
Ooh, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think it's across the bay in Alameda.
That's what I said, Alameda. I know that.
But where is Alameda?
Oh, Wessels.
Yes,
Yeah.
nuclear vessels. Yes. Oh yeah, that's true. They need the nuclear. They need the. Oh, okay. So that's why, like, they need the nuclear core to refuel their Klingon vessel. And so you think, okay, so maybe that's what they had in mind when they designed the Phoenix for. Okay,
maybe.
Okay, now it makes sense. Okay.
So now another Star Trek plot that has time travel and not nukes.
No, I mean, in the frequently, like, they'll want to go back to like Wild West times or
the Nazis.
Yeah, the time travel. I mean, there are episodes where they'll play with like they'll have some chain of events that looks like the ship's going to get destroyed. I just watched an episode of Enterprise actually the other day where it looks like the ship's going to get destroyed, and then there's some time issue, and they're able to like somehow reboot the timeline to where they were, that kind of thing.
And there's yesterday's Enterprise in Next Generation where there's a temporal vortex and there's an Enterprise from a different timeline, and so they play with timelines. I mean, they use that in the reboots, actually, the timeline thing.
Right.
There's this assumption based on physics that there's an infinity of possible timelines. So anything can happen dramatically, basically, which is kind of, I'm not so happy about that. Time travel episodes are a great way to explore what is Star Trek to us today. That's it's a self-reflexive thing. It's about how do we understand Star Trek and science fiction more generally, and what it means to us today. Can we be better? Should we be better? Should we cooperate? Is the word like, it would be interesting to have a time travel episode where they go and then they're like, we're fine. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. That's what I like about the movie. I'm not so much into the action Star Trek personally. And I thought, the action in there tends to be a little drawn out. Like, I don't really buy Jean-Luc Picard, like, at the end.
Yeah.
No, I don't. Like, they really want to make it into, like, a super cool action movie. Star Trek is really not about action.
What I liked about it, though, is it didn't feel heavy-handed, and it felt like it was almost like if you have to feed your dog a pill, you wrap it in some cheese or ham or something. It felt like this was something to keep the masses happy, but there was actually a pretty good message in there about meeting what humanity was right before we had this epiphany.
And again, Braga and Ron Moore, like, the fans give them and whatever, but these guys are like top-notch storytellers. I'm sorry to say, like, this is a very square and very well structured movie, and takes us by the hands, and there are light moments and there are stakes, and it's fun and it's exciting. And you know why we sort of forget about all these little details, like how do they come back to Earth and stuff like that? It's because it's so well written and so exciting
that's a good
sort
point.
of like in Star Wars is full of holes like that, but you don't pay attention because yeah, it's about the characters. It's not about the little gizmos.
Unless you're Tim Westmeyer and you have a podcast about tearing
it's
movies
kind of
apart.
My bread and butter. Yeah.
And then you're super critical.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you mentioned the reboots for Star Trek. Do you think, when they did Star Trek Into Darkness, which again, I enjoyed as a film, I wish it was better, but I at least enjoyed it as a film. I had a good experience at the theater. But with this reimagined Wrath of Khan storyline that they did in the reboot, do you think the reboots should do First Contact, cover it in some way, talk about...
Oh my god! Oh no!
Did I get to something?
No, I personally, I'm like, the reboots, they're all like super hypercharged, super emotions, daddy issues, super actions. Like they never walk on the Enterprise; they run all the time. Like it's and the lens flares and all that. So as action movies, in the era of Marvel, I understand that's what they're competing with. I'm too old. I guess I'm too old. I don't connect with this on any level. I find that it hurts my brain.
Is your son old enough to enjoy Star Trek?
Yeah, but he doesn't like violence.
Okay.
Like he watched the first 10 minutes of Star Wars, like New Hope, and he was like, I can't. So he's actually into the episodes of Next Generation that are like mind puzzles, but he's like, the science is.
He sounds too French, Manu. You got to get him. It doesn't sound like an American child and loves a good violent movie.
No, I mean, he's growing up here, and but he's like that. Like the action thing, like gets me tired. Like when you look at First Contact, it's really the beginning of that era of super big action blockbusters all the time with lots of emotions and stakes and it's done artfully because it's Star Trek and good writers, and they don't try to turn them into superheroes or super villains. But what has come in the past 20 years is just mind-bogglingly tiresome. But again, I'm old. And we know that the Star Trek Discovery new series is going to be more of that Game of Thrones in space type of thing. Like, the Klingons, the war, space.
Are you going to watch it?
Action. I have to. I think the best Star Trek movie ever is Galaxy Quest.
I love that film. That's a good one.
Right? It's about the fans. Yeah. It's about us.
Yeah, that's very cool.
All right, so let's do our rating system. We always rate it 1 out of 5 so that we can have a really consistent rating system, but also tailor it so that we get right into the detail. I thought here we should do 1 out of 5 warp speeds, right? So 1.0 warp speed is fine if all you want to do is get noticed by some random Vulcans. But if you crank it up to 5, then you can buzz the Vulcan home planet and make everybody on the planet spill their coffee during your flyby. Like, it's a pretty good one. I'll go quickly. I think I give this a 4. I really enjoy this film. It's probably one of my favorite Star Trek movies. It's one of the ones that I enjoyed when I was younger and watched it, and I think it still holds up. There are these issues with the film that we talked about, but I'd really recommend it. I think if you're a fan of Star Trek or this genre of film and you haven't seen it, you're really missing out.
Yeah, I'd give it a 4 as well. I think that's right. I mean, I think it's a solid film, and even from a perspective of a Star Trek fan, I think it hits all the right buttons and seems to be a crowd pleaser as well.
I give it a 4 as well, because I don't want to give it a 5 because the 5 is reserved for the Whales movie and the motion picture.
Yeah, and Nemesis.
But I give it a solid 4 because I love Jean-Luc Picard, and it's not because I'm French. It's because Jean-Luc Picard is a good person.
Now, how do you feel about the fact that they couldn't find an actual Frenchman to play?
No, actually, they wanted this French actor. Like Roddenberry really wanted that guy with a French accent, and the producers were like, "Oh, no." And so they found, sorry for the Apple ratings, but the story is like, and then they like one of the producers was walking by at UCLA or something, and there was Patrick Stewart giving a lecture on Shakespeare, and I was like, okay, that's our guy. And so they sort of convinced Roddenberry that yes, an Englishman was, Shakespearean Englishman would do the trick.
But the name is so good, we can't change the name.
You know where it comes from?
No.
It's from the Picard family. Bertrand Picard and all the guy who flew the first balloon like super high in the 30s. Then his son did the bathyscaphe. And then the grandson is the guy who flew around the world in the solar.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Airplane.
Yeah.
So you should. It's spelled Picard, Piccard. But it's come from that. The model of the elder Picard was the model for Professor Sunbeam in Tintin.
That's cool. Wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Very cool.
So that's Star Trek lore for you, man.
Well, you're already giving me some homework to follow up on stuff. So I'm going to do the same thing for our listeners. We usually have a segment where we talk about stuff to recommend, and these will all be in the show notes so people can get to them. The first is I talked about the overview effect. There's a book on it, The Overview Effect: Space Exploration and Human Evolution, written by F. White. in 1998. I think this is a really fun read. It's one of my favorite books I read in high school. So good one to check out. The second thing is a terrible but kind of fun TV movie from 1988 called Disaster at Silo 7. And it's about the Titan II accident. Stars Peter Boyle and Dennis Weaver. So it's definitely a film I recommend checking out. The third thing is Command and Control, which we have talked about a number of times, but previously it's a great source on nuclear accidents, missile histories, all that stuff. But there's a documentary movie in case you don't want to read. It's a huge, like 500-page book. So I would check that out. It talks about this particular incident in Damascus, Arkansas, as well as other nuclear broken arrow incidents and things like that. Gabe, do you have anything you want to recommend?
Yeah, to avoid Manu having to engage in shameless self-promotion, I will name his book, Trekonomics. You should all read it. It's an excellent treatment of Star Trek from a perspective of looking at the society and how we might actually be closer to Star Trek today than you might imagine. And I guess the second thing I would recommend is if you like if you like the movie, to watch The Best of Both Worlds, which is a 2-part episode of Star Trek Next Generation that shows Picard being assimilated by the Borg and introduces the Borg. And I think if it really is the turning point for the Next Generation, where it really came into its own and became its asserted its independence from Star Trek the original series, which it was largely compared to prior to that.
Great. That's my kind of homework. What about you, Manu? Anything you want to recommend?
Yes, actually, so it's more about global destruction and the effects of global destruction and global catastrophes. I just finished this book called The Ends of the World by Peter Brannen, and it's about the past extinctions and the geological traces of past extinctions on Earth. And I think in a way this is the book that kind of closely resembles The Day After for global warming, because it tells us through the geological record of what happened in the past extinctions, and usually it was all caused by changes in the carbon cycle in the planet. It's absolutely magnificent in terms of the writing. It's also scary as I'm sorry, and it's to me this is the best book this year so far. So, and I want to plug it because it hasn't gotten enough exposure, and the writer is a fantastic guy, and it's beautifully written. You guys should check it out. Absolutely. The Ends of the World by Peter Brannen.
Yeah, that's a great title. The Ends of the World. Okay, yeah, we'll check that out. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Live long and prosper.
I'm going to send you a token of appreciation. This is a 1990s Pog from my Pog collection when I was a kid. We don't know what Klingon is on it, but there's some kind of Klingon on it. So we'll send this to you.
And you can figure out who this is. So we were unable to determine.
But thanks very much. Where can people find you?
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
where can people find you on Twitter and where else they can check out your research?
I usually tweet at Trekonomics, and that's about it. I don't really have Facebook or anything. Just Twitter.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or want to tell us what we got wrong, Star Trek or nuke-wise, there are a couple ways you can contact the show. You can go on Facebook, facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast. We're on Twitter @nuclearpodcast, and email supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. Manu and I actually got introduced over Twitter, so I recommend checking that as a way to gauge the show. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmeyer.
And Gabe.
And Manu Saadia.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we're bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.